What do you do as a country? What do you do when you as a government have run out of money to spend? Or, as Margaret Thatcher would put it, as a government run out of other people's money to spend. Yeah. Famously, she said...
Because the government doesn't have any money of its own.
No, its own, no. Only assets and income that belong to taxpayers, yeah. So we're looking at a situation where there may well be having continuing strikes with trains being stopped. This is our interpretation, I guess, Barolo was putting earlier, that there just isn't enough money to increase the salaries of the people working there.
And I'm sure that the railways have suffered from lack of people travelling on them, just as many other industries have had a problem over the coronavirus period.
Yeah. Now, Simon Clarke, who's the Chief Secretary to the Treasury in the UK, the government continues to support negotiations between rail companies and unions. He says this: I do think it's important that we send a message that industrial action is likely to proceed, therefore people have to make sensible preparations. But of course he is talking about ongoing negotiations to try and stop these sort of actions happening in the future. But he says this: the government doesn't sit as part of those talks for a good reason. We don't intervene, he says, in the specific process between the employer and the unions, but we are there to provide the support and enabling framework for those talks to proceed. That seems a bit mealy-mouthed to me.
Yes, that'll be the day, because the day this government starts putting in plans for the future, long-term plans, that'll be the day.
Yes, feared job losses, restructuring of the train companies. There's been a recent forecast of inflation to reach 11% this year, which means the real terms pay is going to be really heavily cut. Now, just a brief comment on things like what are the causes of this. Now, I would say that experts in the government appeared to think over the past couple of years that you could spend lots and lots of money, you could lock down the country, stop wealth generation, and also pay out lots and lots of money and not have a problem with the economy and inflation going forward. Whereas almost every normal person thought it was a stupid thing to do, and you were going to have problems. Am I right in saying that?
Yes, I think so.
So have we got problems with our supposed experts not having enough expertise?
The economy is compared to a magic money tree.
Yes.
We all know that trees grow naturally from being planted in soil.
Yes,
but,
they need nourishment.
Money doesn't work like that. It doesn't grow just by being planted in something.
No, you need to work at producing it. That's right, yeah. Now, money is only really an expression of commodities, an expression of resources. And,
that's right.
Actual wealth is not money. Money is just an artifice, an artificial representation of that. So if you stop production, you're going to have problems. If you keep spending money, you're effectively printing money, or I suppose digitally creating money. It doesn't really exist.
No, it doesn't.
We can see that there's been an issue here. So, but what do you do then? We're in that situation now. Let's not.
Well, I think
what can they do? What can they do about it?
The world is in that situation at the moment.
Yeah, I wouldn't say every country, but lots of countries are in that position
okay.
who followed similar policies. We were referring earlier in this show to Israel, which effectively sold its soul to Pfizer. You know, it took a lot of money in and had the entire country vaccinated. Many countries did follow the same policies of not treating for COVID-19, instead waiting for a vaccine and then locking down in the meantime. That's the short version, if you like, of what happened. But also seem to follow the same policy of lying to their populations about it. You know, we're going to lock down just for a few weeks. In fact, it was always going to be, as seen in, for example, in the UK, the Coronavirus Act intends there to be a year, including stopping elections for a whole year, even though they were saying publicly it's just for a few weeks. Now, that policy having been being put into place in many countries, as you say, around the world, Bill, a lot of people are in this same situation. The government has run out of money. So train drivers can't be supported in the same way. You can't have the same subsidies to the transport industry you might have had in the past. Is that right? We just can't afford it? Do we have to just stop doing that sort of thing? Is that the answer?
We can't afford to pay out money for nothing to anybody. The government doesn't have money of its own.
So let's tease out those two issues. transport, should it be subsidised at all? I mean, because transport, being able to travel around the country at a reasonable rate, a rate that you can afford, doesn't that help commerce and help the economy get going again?
But it's also expensive to travel by car.
No, we're not subsidising that,
fuel.
yeah. Mm-hmm.
So, effectively, it's saying people shouldn't be travelling at all.
Yeah,
and, of course, over the last 20 years, perhaps even longer, people have been travelling far and wide to enable them to do the jobs that they like to do.
Mm-hmm. So we've got that issue. Should it be subsidised? You're saying no, shouldn't be subsidised, because if you subsidise trains, for example, you're only subsidising certain types of transport.
It depends how you feel about it, because we're into climate change and not using fossil fuels and so on. The government is saying, don't use your cars.
Well, this was the other issue I was going to come to. Is it actually, we're looking at what do you do when you run out of money? Do you, in fact, instead of subsidising, stop taking money, as much money that isn't yours? For example, because of the government's expressed belief that fossil fuels are bad, a use of them is bad in certain locations. I'll come back to that in a second, but in certain locations fossil fuels are bad. So in your car it's bad to use fossil fuel. This is what they're saying, so they're moving to electric cars. So then you have tax on fuel, but you also are forcing an industry, the car industry, to change the way that cars run.
But I don't know that that answers the problem, really, because if you're going to use electric cars, you need a source of electricity. Do we get electricity?
Well, that's a brilliant point, because, of course, you get electricity from mainly fossil fuel power stations. Mm-hmm. So it doesn't do anything.
The ideal would be that you work close to home and that you can actually walk to your place of work, which used to be the case.
No, this conversation is taking an interesting turn. That's a very good point, because what you're saying is it's not the solution to this issue. The government can't afford to subsidise transport. What is it you can do as a government when you run out of other people's money to spend? What can you do? Well, I suppose there's nothing you can do just as a government. You need to change the whole culture.
Yes, absolutely.
So in this particular case of transport, what can be done? Well, work closer to home.
Yes.
Yeah, interesting
I think, to some extent, the virus taught us a few lessons. And one lesson was we have to tighten our belt and stop living on such a prodigious lifestyle.
Yes.
Because we just can't afford it. Now, the government, every time I go along to the petrol station, basically takes a large chunk of money out of my credit card.
Yeah.
And so if I can't afford it, the government can't have it, and the government has got to manage without it. So the government perhaps should stop subsidising the railway industry, and the railways have got to stand on their own feet.
Yes.
Whereas at the moment, I think the quote yesterday was that the government has subsidised the railway industry to the tune of £600 per household.
Is that right? I didn't have this. That's interesting.
That's a frightening number,
Yeah.
isn't it? So we've got to learn to manage within our own resources. I mean, perhaps it's a bit impracticable, but I have wondered whether the first so many gallons of petrol per month is subsidised. Anything that you spend over that, you have to pay the full price for. You're
suggesting a government intervention in that way?
Yeah, that would encourage people to get jobs close to home.
Yeah.
Somebody else was sort of saying, well, it means that my mother, who lives 50 miles away from me, I can't go and see her 3 times a week. There's something wrong in that equation as well. And that's all to do with families that have split up and exploded, and families that have fallen apart and so on. We're actually reaping the consequences of bad management, bad economic situation, bad lifestyles, etc., etc. How can you go back? I just don't know. I think we are doomed. We are doomed. I can say nothing other than that.
Yeah, I think Solomon back in the Old Testament said that if you sow the wind, you reap the whirlwind, I think. And,
Solomon had a lot of wisdom.
Yes. US Senator Schumer, who said in a rather emotional speech against President Trump, you have sown the wind and you'll pay the price. I thought that's And he's Jewish, I think. He hasn't quite got a grasp of the scriptures there. But that's an interesting point that you make. That seemed, Norman, an entirely sensible thing to do. That's sort of effectively subsidising fuel for local travel. But my fear of this sort of thing, Beryl, is whenever governments do something that seems entirely sensible, everything seems to fall apart. Eventually, it has unintended consequences that ruin everything.
Yes, I can see that in a number of directions, actually. The government, although we depend upon it so much to be ruled and governed and directed, it does have a tendency to fall apart.
Yes.
You're going on the Polden principle. You see, I believe that Parliament should take votes on everything as to what should happen.
Oh, my goodness.
And then we should do the other thing. Because when you look back to history, they've always got it wrong. So we should use that as a sign. The government should take a vote of what should happen, and we should put it in the "that's not what we're going to do" category.
President Ronald Reagan, former president of the US, said that 9 most terrifying words in the English language are "I'm from the government and I'm here to help." And I think that summarises the issue you have here, that when governments try to help, they end up messing things up. And that's for various different reasons. And I would say not just in isolated incidents, but when they run anything, a national government ends up messing things up. And one example that's will become obvious if you travel to a communist country. I travelled into China when they're still operating more on actual politically communist principles. I mean, the party's still very much in power, but they have a very different system to the West. But they had, under communist principles, of course, all the major supplies, health, the education system, and food supplies were all handled by the government. So large state-run stores provided your food, in the major cities at least. Now, this was true in Russia as well. And other communist countries took on board this, and they ended up with the famous bread lines you had to queue up because there just wasn't enough. Food production, food distribution is messed up so much by government. Now, if we look at this country, we have, again, major supplies of things that we need run by the government. The National Health Service, slightly privatised, but not really. It's handled by the government nationally. And also we have, let's say something else, the education system run by government. But let's take another sector. Food, as I mentioned earlier. Distribution of food is by private companies, big private companies, some of them, by big supermarkets, and competition from local shops. And it's done so brilliantly. If you just go to a supermarket, then go to a hospital and see if you get the same sort of treatment. Go to a supermarket and then go to your school, your local school, see how it's doing, your local state school. The government, this is my suggestion, Beryl, what do you do when you run out of money and you want to sort this out? You've run out of other money, people's money. What do you do? I would say, just stop. Just stop doing it. Get out of all these areas. The government should do the minimum that it has to do. Protect the country from attack from outside, ensure security inside, and make sure, things generally are safe. That's all they need to do.
And I would also say, how do you manage your own money? You need to budget. You need to work out how you can make your money stretch from day to day. Portion it out from day to day. Don't use more than you have for one day.
Yes.
And then live the best you can on that.
Yes, it's interesting. The policies that we're following now under a Conservative government seem to be the opposite of that under the Thatcher government from 79 into the 80s. She followed a monetarist policy. So in order to control the economy, the effect that you could have on the economy was restricting the money supply. You're trying to make it such that people spend within their means.
Yes.
Whereas now it's the opposite with what's become known as quantitative easing, used to be known as printing money, seems to be the order of the day. Increasing the amount of money leads to huge amounts of inflation. Now, the problem with the monetary policy is, of course, you end up with unemployment. And if you don't have industry that's successful, then those industries are going to fail. But to Norman's point earlier, the question we have to ask ourselves is, if they're going to fail if a fair price is paid, shouldn't they fail?
That's a good point.
Isn't that fair and just that if you're not producing what people want for the money you're charging, that you shouldn't be around?
Some may say that is a little harsh.
Look, Beryl, here on Beryl and Pete, we want to just face the facts and say it as it
Yes.
is. Right? That is my opinion. That's not me just playing devil's advocate. I think that the government shouldn't be in the position of propping up companies, because then they are choosing the winners.
I heard
And it's
a
not fair.
hospitality outlet the other day, one of their employees was saying, well, the government should help us. Why don't they bring back Eat Out to help out?
Yes.
But we all know
'Cause that was such a
when
success.
we go to a restaurant or a bar or a pub, we will pay more for the food that we eat than if we were to buy it and cook it ourselves.
Yes, of course. This is what I would say. I don't think I'm arguing with here, Beryl. I think we're agreeing, but I think that we'll try and bring the listeners into this. Don't you think, gentle listener, Beryl and I are saying, well, the government needs to, as the Americans would say, butt out of a lot of the things they're involved in. Not everything, but a lot of it. And that would decrease expenditure. And that goes a long way towards answering the question, what do you do when you don't have enough money? Well, stop spending it.
Yes.
Stop spending so much. But take that particular instance in the hospitality sector, say, why not bring back Eat Out to Help Out, which was a government scheme where they would pay for your meal here in the UK. Well, the problem was caused by the government locking down the restaurants and forcing them to close. Are they going to sort it out? Can they just butt out? That's what.
Yes.
Yeah. Okay, so I think we're drawing stumps here, coming to a conclusion on this, and that is that we think here on Beryl and Pete, the government should stop spending money. It needs to pull out of whole sectors where it's inserted itself. Transport, education. I mean secondary education. I think the government may well have a role in primary education, making sure that people can read and write, but maybe not even that. But certainly secondary education has been, in my view, a big disaster and very, very expensive.
Yeah.
Do what they do with food distribution and apply the same principle. Let companies fight it out for who's best, and you end up having a good service. There's the answer, everyone. What a simple answer. It probably isn't going to be that simple, so let us know what you think. Get in touch with the show. You can email us, flameccr@gmail.com, that'll get to the station, or just go to our website, berylandpete.com, and you'll see the podcast and a way to comment on each episode.